Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way, but yeah. Okay.
That's how you recognize who's you.
We're going to go back, page 180. Verse 6. And we don't have as much time today. Without going too deeply into this, I was just thinking as I was coming over that the material we've been discussing it's been a good 5-6 weeks, maybe longer, I'm not sure, since high holidays? No, I don't know how long we've been discussing it, are actually really big and important topics that societies have to face. For instance, how do you fund the government? What's a fair way of funding the government? Also, what do employers owe employees, and what do employees owe employers? Also, what are the sources of authority? How do you figure out who's in charge and who should be making rulings? These are really big, important issues for societies to decide. And in some ways, you expect to have those conversations during election seasons, right? Because that's, you're going to come up with ideas and people are going to go back and forth and think, I like this idea better. How about this idea? That's the point in a democracy of an election season, where you have conversations about these really big, important issues. And how to fund the government is very important. How to fund religious institutions, and also really how the economic structure should work that benefits both employers and employees. I mean, behind the scenes of these debates, you hear things like this all the time. What of course you're noticing in the Talmud is a kind of a calm deliberation, which is very difficult to reproduce in a democracy. Where you have these, especially now for whatever reason nowadays, where emotions are so high, and you have politicians that are appealing to people's anger, anxiety, and nervousness, and you have some of that in the Talmud, but the Talmud really kind of encourages a calm spiritual discussion too, because the Talmud also, the sources of authority go back to the Torah and how God wants what's best for human beings and wants the good and best life for human beings. Anyway.
Does it influence the Talmud that it was written by people living in the time of kings?
Sure, I think it does. I think it does. Yeah, I think that's the big difference in culture, and we probably don't want to go too deeply into this because it'll take us too far afield. But having these conversations in a participatory democracy is very different than having the conversations around a small table where it's not a democracy. There are elements of a democracy in the Talmud, elements of a democracy in ancient Babylonia and Greece. They had some of the ideas, but it's very different today. But the notion that you spend time talking about what's good and right for a society, trading ideas and using your intellect, and maybe also your spiritual expression, prayer, study sacred texts, to come up with solutions or better ways of living, is still a very important idea. All right, let's So what we're talking about is so just getting back to the tachlis of the topic here. Is the fact, so page 180, verse 6, is the fact that a buyer, someone who buys, maybe because he owns a field, so he buys produce from a farmer, have to tithe on that produce before he sells it. And remember, we talked about that last week. So it's not an income tax as much as a property tax. We've already assumed that the buyer does have to. So if you own a store, you have to tithe your produce before you sell it. But is that obligation deoraita? Does it come directly from the Torah? Or is it the Rabbanan? Is it something that the rabbis invented? Now, if the rabbis invented it, it's still authoritative. But it means it doesn't come from the Torah, and it's something the rabbis kind of imposed on their own society. So that's the question. So that's where, and we talked about it briefly, and we had a story. So verse 6, V'lokeach me deoraita mi mechayev. Okay, so the idea that a buyer has to pay tithing, is that actually obligated from the Torah? Ve'atanya, because we have the following story. Mipnei ma charvu chanayot shel Beit Hino. Why were the stores of Beit Hino destroyed? Shalosh shanim kodem Yerushalayim, page 181, 3 years before Jerusalem was destroyed. That would be the year 67. So there was a punishment, and these stores were a punishment from God, and these stores were destroyed before Jerusalem was destroyed. Mipnei, because of this reading, she'amidu divreihem al divrei Torah. Now, hamidu divreihem means they stood by the words of the Torah, meaning that they stood by the words of the Torah and ignored the rabbis, so ignored rabbinic injunctions. Shahayu omrim, because they would read the Torah and say, aser to aser, it says in the Torah, you should tithe. Ve'achalta, that's when you, the farmer, are eating the produce or using the produce. V'lo mocher. It doesn't say anything in the Torah about a buyer coming in because he's setting up a store and that person needing to tithe. So those merchants at Beit Hino did not want to pay the tithe because they look at the Torah and say, hey, Torah doesn't say anything about me tithing. It says a lot about the farmer tithing, but it doesn't say me tithing. And they continued reading. Tvuat zaracha, you pay a tithe on your seed, the seed meaning the farmer, but v'lo lokeach, but not the buyer, because it's not the buyer's seed. It's not the buyer's seed that creates the produce. So a strict reading of the Torah would teach us that a buyer doesn't have to tithe, and these merchants would say, look, I'm just reading the Torah, and they would ignore the rabbis, and therefore they were destroyed. God got mad at them, so they were destroyed because they ignored the authority of the rabbis. But what we here in our classroom learned from this Baraita is that they were right that the obligation to tithe doesn't come from the Torah. It's very clear it's not in the Torah. It comes from the rabbis. Now, of course, nevertheless, you have to follow it, but it was implied earlier because they quoted another verse that this obligation comes from the Torah. So what difference does it make? It actually does make a difference because obligations from the Torah are stricter. They're harder to overturn. A rabbi can come and rule something. The next generation, another group can come and take it away. Much more difficult to do that d'oraita. So therefore, we want to establish in our own community, because now they're looking back at this 300 years earlier, we want to establish in our own community the obligation for a merchant to tithe. Does that come from the Torah, or is it a rabbinic enactment? Because in fact, it could matter, because it'd be harder to overturn d'oraita. You can still overturn d'oraita too, by the way, but it's harder. Yes.
Did it distinguish between d'oraita of the written Torah from the oral Torah?
D'oraita means that there is a way to derive the particular law from the Torah.
From the written Torah.
From the written Torah, absolutely, from the written Torah.
Oral Torah was d'Rabbanan.
Oral Torah is d'Rabbanan.
Is d'Rabbanan.
That's d'Rabbanan, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it. Okay. All right. So now the Talmud comes to the conclusion, Ella midrabbanan, the whole thing is a rabbinic enactment, and the fact that because earlier we had quoted a verse to prove that the whole practice actually comes from the Torah, but and I talked about this last week, asmachna ba'alma. That's just an asmachta. It's a very difficult Aramaic word to translate. It literally means a support. Some people mistranslate it as a proof text. So the thing is the opposite of a proof text. It's just a weak kind of support. You want to say the idea is alluded to in the Torah. It's not like so far-fetched because we have a sense of it from the Torah, but an asmachta is never a proof text. So you can't use it to prove a particular law. You can say, well, the Torah was thinking along those lines, so I have this verse from the Torah, so it's not inconsistent with some ideas in the Torah, so I can quote it as an asmachna, but my source of authority is not the verse. The source of my authority is I'm a rabbi, and by virtue of me being a rabbi, I get to make some rules. Okay? And sometimes rabbis will quote verses. So you have asmachtas, of course, much more often in sermons than you'll have in legal ruling, because every time I quote a verse in the Torah as a sermon, you know that I'm just giving it's to give myself ideological support, but it doesn't mean that I'm putting myself in the same plane as the Torah. But you have them sometimes in halachic agreements too. It adds a little bit. Okay, so here's an asmachta just to tell you that what we're doing here is not so far afield. Okay, any questions?
So asmachta be'alma would be relying on God in loose translation.
Asmachta means a support, but alma means merely.
Yeah.
Merely, yeah.
So
It's merely that's the adverb is important there too. It's merely an asmachta.
So you have here a panel, a self-appointed panel, I guess, but a panel.
Well, it's not self-appointed. Be careful, because is the Supreme Court self-appointed? I mean, they're
appointed this group who's making.
There are criteria. You know, there are criteria to become a rabbi, to be ordained as a rabbi. Now, it's the rabbis that make the criteria, in the same way that it's faculty very often in universities that create So yes, or it's judges that make the criteria for other judges. But
so is there a level of force behind a ruling if you have a panel of rabbis versus a single rabbi somewhere making a statement?
Yeah, so there are rules, you know, and I don't know with specificity, but it's not like a single rabbi making a ruling. It's a panel of rabbis. They're ordained rabbis. They have to have the title rabbi. You know, they have to go through a certain amount of training. So you have all that. Okay.
Did it vary from area to area?
It did. It varied from area to area, yeah. I mean, a lot of Jewish history is an attempt to centralize something that almost by definition can't be centralized because we're dealing with Jews, far afield in different cultures. I mean, yeah.
Two people, three opinions.
Yeah.
You know.
People look at the Catholic Church with this kind of longing, like, why can't we have that hierarchy that the Catholic Church has? And I have an even better idea. I'll be the Pope, and I'll just decide. So every time there's an attempt to centralize, there's somebody that wants to be the Pope, and surprisingly, nobody else agrees that we don't actually think you should be the Pope. I think I should be the Pope, and so it devolves into local communities make their own decisions. So in fact, it's very decentralized and local, and there's so as the rules come down to us, it's very decentralized. So that's why local rabbis have a lot of authority in the end. Even like something like the chief rabbinate in Israel right now is really ahistorical. It's really, I mean, it's a very unusual institution that you'd have a chief rabbi that's actually designated and elected as a chief rabbi. And the fact is, the chief rabbi doesn't have very much authority.
That's true.
Yeah, they don't. I mean, it's mostly just a political.
Yeah, but that gives
symbolic
a lot of authority.
Yeah.
I remember when we went to our Eastern European trip to Poland, we went to a community called Tikhvin, and what they told us there at the time is that was a gathering point for rabbis every 4 or 5 years, where they come together from Lithuania, they come together from Poland, they come together.
Yeah, that's right. It's interesting. You have better memory than me. Yeah,
that's right. And they would adjudicate issues like we're talking about.
Yeah.
And that's how many of the rules that they set up came about. But it was like a conference.
It is. So Vilna was for a brief time. It was at a certain historic moment where a lot of Jews lived in Vilna. There was a lot of intellectual high power, and there was an attempt to really get the rabbis together and really make decisions collectively. And I think it worked for a little while.
So I could see how Yiddish-speaking people would have one set of rules and Sephardic, and then or Ladino speaking, and an Arabic speaking another set of rules.
Yeah, that was the big issue. But there were Jews that were far flung geographically, so it's hard to impose some kind of order. And there were serious cultural issues too, and different traditions. So I think this sort of decentralized approach allowed Judaism to flourish in really interesting ways, and the system sort of works because of that. But it's not without tension. I mean, look at San Diego. You've got it's very hard, very, very hard to act collectively in San Diego. There's very few institutions that bring us all together, and so we can bemoan that, but it's also part of just the sort of decentralized vibe that we've had in Jewish history forever.
Is there a need for a central authority here, really?
Every once in a while it would help. Every once in a while there's threats to the community that it would be useful if we had better central institutions. But I've kind of given up on. I don't want to complain too much about it. I mean, every once in a while we can act collectively, but it's much more difficult for us. Yeah.
Well, one thing I wanted to say was that within conservative Judaism, if people want to go to a central authority to ask questions, there is a law committee of the Rabbinical Assembly.
Right.
And within San Diego, even from the time that I came here in 1962 to now, there was a time when there was all the rabbis in San Diego did have a functioning get-together.
Yeah.
That's not been so for a long time.
Well, there's an organization. There is, and we get together.
But I mean, they were more collegiate. Let's put it that way.
So I mean, I don't want to go that deeply into it. I will say, just to correct the record, it's being taped. I mean, there is a San Diego Rabbinic Association. It's a going concern. We get together. There's collegial relationships. The biggest weakness is that, and this isn't a secret. The biggest weakness is that Orthodox rabbis don't take part. They don't participate. So that's a lot of rabbis that by just pure ideology won't participate, so that limits the effectiveness of the organization. Because in fact, it's the group that would tend to agree anyway that gets together, whereas the group that would have different opinions doesn't even come to the table. So we can't even compromise because there's nobody offering another compromise, right?
Shabbat San Diego was a step in the right
direction. It was. In fact, it was an amazing moment, and it's possible that something can build from that. It was,
I didn't hear that term.
Shabbat in San Diego, I mean.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, and we were an important synagogue in that. I mean, the fact that we have a synagogue next door that's Orthodox, that we were able to cooperate enough that we got together for. Yeah, that was a very, very important moment. I don't know if people realize it was, because it never happened like that in my career here. And,
well, there's a different mindset. I mean, because one time when I was doing a yard site and I had a fellow who was Orthodox. And at that time we were not getting minions. This was years ago, and he was reluctant to come because he was Orthodox. Yes, it's a conservative. Just
all right.
Mind-boggling.
Let's we don't have much time. Let's go to. So we're going to go back to that verse. So the verse that they quote, it's at the bottom of page 181. The verse that they quote that may indicate, turns out it's an asmachna, but may indicate that this idea of a merchant tithing is from the Torah. Now, the verse is interesting because it doesn't seem to have anything to do with a merchant tithing. I'm going to remind you. So, and actually, it goes back to something really interesting about how how in the Bible they saw their society structured economically, and then how it comes down to the Talmud. We talked about it before. So the original verse about a worker being able to eat as much produce as he or she wants starts in the Torah, but the actual verse in the Torah is anybody walking through your field can take whatever they want at any time. And the operative word, interestingly, is kinafshecha. You eat whatever you want. Kinafshecha is according to your appetite. Okay, so the rabbis take that, they limit it. They still say it's still right there, but they use their own interpretive powers, and they limit it, and they say, well, this must only refer to a worker. Because if you remember there is a limit in the verse itself where it says, but you can't put it in a bucket. You're cutting through somebody's field, and you're hungry, take a few grapes, but don't collect the grapes because you're not paying for them. So they focus on the buck and say, well, this can't just be anybody walking through the field. It must be a worker. But they actually learn from that verse that that person walking through the field doesn't have to tithe. The worker, doesn't have to tithe. The owner doesn't have to tithe. So they learn from that, since the verse teaches us that the owner doesn't have to tithe, the worker doesn't have to tithe, everybody else must have to tithe. Who's everybody else? That's the buyer. And that becomes the proof text. Now the proof text is no longer a proof text for this, it's an asmachta. It's not strong enough a text. And by the way, it is a pretty weak text to prove, because it doesn't say a buyer or a merchant somehow has to pay tithe. So so now they have to go back to that verse and say, okay, so you've taken that verse. That verse no longer actually proves that merchants have to tithe. So what's the point of that verse? That's always something the rabbis will bring up. So I'm going to keep going. Ella kinafshecha, that word that the worker can eat whatever he or she wants. Lemai ata. What does that teach us? To turn the page 182. Now we're getting this to be something that's going to be troubling, I think, to some of us, because it's an area of there's a whole area of employer-employee law that the rabbis derive from how to treat your animals. So that's going to make us uncomfortable. Now, the outcome, it's important too, the outcome is really actually very humanist legislation, which I think we'll admire. But the way of getting at it is to somehow make an analogy from your animal, I think will be troubling to us. So we're going to spend some time on that. So, Lech Tanya, as it's written in a Baraita, page 182, Kinafshecha, Ma nafshecha, im chasamta patur. Okay, so first of all, you can walk through a field, eat what you want according to your nefesh, your appetite. Okay, that, according to the rabbis, that nefesh refers to the worker, but it also refers to you, right? So just like the worker can take whatever he wants, you can take whatever you want and not pay tithe on it, okay? But if you're the owner, if you decide not to eat anything, because you might decide, I'm not going to waste any of my crops, I'm going to walk through it. Im chasamta. Chasamta is a Hebrew word meaning muzzle. If you muzzle yourself and so you don't take anything, then you're exempt from any punishment. You don't have to eat, okay? Af poel im chasamta patur. Also, now it doesn't mean you literally muzzle your worker, but if you tell your worker, you may not take any of the produce, even though, by the way, the Torah, the rabbis explicitly say that the worker can take whatever he wants. What if there's a violation? By the way, so that there's always two areas of law, right? At least two areas. So one area is the law, the other area are the penalties. What are the penalties? So let's say the owner violates the law and tells the worker, You may not. I'll fire you if you don't. If you eat anything amongst the mine. So this rabbi here is saying the owner doesn't have to pay any penalties for that. The owner is not allowed to do it. So there's a cat. And we have this a couple times several times in the Talmud, where there's actually a law with no penalty. Now the no penalty means no penalty on this earth.
Yeah.
Right? It means that God disapproves of this, and you'll have to make an accounting in the next world. But we don't have any penalty for that. And this verse, in this kind of weak exegetical way they're approaching it, proves that that's what the nafshecha means. The nafshecha there means it's like just as you I have to admit it's weak logic, but just as you, the owner, don't have to eat as you're walking through the field, if you prevent your employer from eating, you violated the law, but there's no penalty.
You mean your employee?
I'm sorry, right. That's what I meant. Yeah, your employee. Okay. All right, is that clear? Wow. It shouldn't be, because it doesn't make any sense at all.
It means a lot of them would do that. They're so in line.
Well, so that's a really good question. So if there's no penalty, does that mean there's going to be widespread disobedience? And here, my answer is I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. It's a question of now it's a question of sort of sociology and faith. I mean, did these people believe in the Torah? Did they believe in God? Did they believe in what's right and wrong? It's very hard to know. I mean, I think for us, where we have this sense of law always must be enforced, that the enforcement mechanisms are just as important as the law themselves. It's hard for us to even imagine a system where there would be laws but no enforcement. Although when I was in rabbinical school, some of my professors would say, well, you imagine the red light when there's nobody around. Are you going to go through the red light? And how many people actually do that? Now, of course, the reason it's a weak analogy is because nobody believes that God is controlling the red light. They're like if I go through the red light at 3 a.m. on a country road, I know there's nobody there, that God's going to disapprove. But you'd be surprised how many people would stop at that red light anyway, just the force of following authority. But if you believe, and I can't answer the question, but because I don't know enough about the society, but if you believe that God really cares that I feed my employees well, then the punishment shouldn't matter. Or if you believe that I'll get punished in the next world, which they did believe, then again the punishment shouldn't matter. And it could be that establishing a system of punishments is in fact a pain in the neck for the rabbis, because then they have to go and hire a whole bunch of enforcement officers, right, to come and keep track, and then there's a whole judicial and court system that gets bogged down. So maybe they just say, there's no penalties, just do it. Just do it. I don't have to fine you. There should be enough ethical, spiritual force that you should just do it.
Maybe they depend on the notion that people are moral, and if they test the law, they'll...
Yeah, right. I suspect there's part of that going on. There's enough trust in a relatively small society, they figure we don't have to have an enforcement mechanism for all of it. It's not murder. Yeah. Last comment.
The first half of that if you muzzle yourself from eating, you're free of punishment, suggests that there's a mild, to me, suggests that you're mildly encouraged to eat. Otherwise,
yes,
right?
Good point.
So that there's a mild, when you go through your fields, you should eat.
You should eat
to fulfill your need.
Right.
So if you block that, maybe there is something wrong with that.
Right.
We won't punish you for it.
Yes, right, exactly. That's exactly. You unpack the analogy actually better than I did, because that's exactly right. There does seem to be some sense that you should eat, but if you don't, we're not going to punish you. You should feed your workers, but if you don't, we're not going to punish you. That's the analogy, right. And it's still not the greatest analogy, but that's the best way to phrase it. Okay.